24 Research methodology. 2. Defining the research problem. In research process, the first and foremost step happens to be that of selecting and properly defining a research problem. A researcher must find the problem and formulate it so that it becomes susceptible to research. Like a medical doctor, a researcher must examine all the symptoms presented to him or observed by him concerning a problem before he can diagnose correctly. To define a problem correctly, a researcher must know what a problem is. What is a research problem? A research problem, in general, refers to some difficulty which a researcher experiences in the context of either a theoretical or practical situation and wants to obtain a solution for the same. Usually we say that a research problem does exist if the following conditions are met with. I. There must be an individual, or a group or an organization, let us call it I, to whom the problem can be attributed. The individual or the organization, as the case may be, occupies an environment, say N, which is defined by values of the uncontrolled variables, yj. E. There must be at least 2 courses of action, say C1 and C2, to be pursued. A course of action is defined by one or more values of the controlled variables. For example, the number of items purchased at a specified time is said to be one course of action. E. There must be at least 2 possible outcomes, say O1 and O2, of the course of action, of which one should be preferable to the other. In other words, this means that there must be at least one outcome that the researcher wants, i.e., an objective. IV. The courses of action available must provide some chance of obtaining the objective, but they cannot provide the same chance, otherwise the choice would not matter. Thus, if P, Oj, I, Cj, N represents the probability that an outcome Oj will occur, if I select Cj and N, then POICN BGBG 1112 does not equal. In simple words, we can say that the choices must have unequal efficiencies for the desired outcomes. We talk of a research problem or hypothesis in case of descriptive or hypothesis testing research studies. Exploratory or formulative research studies do not start with a problem or hypothesis. Their problem is to find a problem or the hypothesis to be tested. One should make a clear statement to this effect. This aspect has been dealt with in chapter entitled, Research Design. Defining the research problem. 25 Over and above these conditions, the individual or the organization can be said to have the problem only if I does not know what course of action is best, i.e., I must be in doubt about the solution. Thus, an individual or a group of persons can be said to have a problem which can be technically described as a research problem, if they, individual or the group having one or more desired outcomes, are confronted with 2 or more courses of action that have some but not equal efficiency for the desired objectives and are in doubt about which course of action is best. We can, thus, state the components 1 of a research problem as under. I. There must be an individual or a group which has some difficulty or the problem. E. There must be some objectives to be attained at. If one wants nothing, one cannot have a problem. E. There must be alternative means or the courses of action for obtaining the objectives one wishes to attain. This means that there must be at least 2 means available to a researcher, for if he has no choice of means, he cannot have a problem. IV. There must remain some doubt in the mind of a researcher with regard to the selection of alternatives. This means that research must answer the question concerning the relative efficiency of the possible alternatives. V. There must be some environments to which the difficulty pertains. Thus, a research problem is one which requires a researcher to find out the best solution for the given problem, i.e., to find out by which course of action the objective can be attained optimally in the context of a given environment. There are several factors which may result in making the problem complicated. For instance, the environment may change, affecting the efficiencies of the courses of action or the values of the outcomes. The number of alternative courses of action may be very large. Persons not involved in making the decision may be affected by it and react to it favorably or unfavorably, and similar other factors. All such elements, or at least the important ones, may be thought of in context of a research problem. Selecting the problem. The research problem undertaken for study must be carefully selected. The task is a difficult one, although it may not appear to be so. Help may be taken from a research guide in this connection. Nevertheless, every researcher must find out his own salvation, for research problems cannot be borrowed. A problem must spring from the researcher's mind like a plant springing from its own seed. If our eyes need glasses, it is not the optician alone who decides about the number of the lens we require. We have to see ourselves and enable him to prescribe for us the right number by cooperating with him. Thus, a research guide can at the most only help a researcher choose a subject. However, the following points may be observed by a researcher in selecting a research problem or a subject for research. A subject which is overdone should not be normally chosen, for it will be a difficult task to throw any new light in such a case. Controversial subject should not become the choice of an average researcher. 1. R.L. Ackoff, The Design of Social Research, Chicago University Press, Chicago, 1961. 26. Research methodology. Too narrow or too vague problems should be avoided. IV. The subject selected for research should be familiar and feasible so that the related research material or sources of research are within one's reach. Even then it is quite difficult to supply definitive ideas concerning how a researcher should obtain ideas for his research. For this purpose, a researcher should contact an expert or a professor in the university who is already engaged in research. He may as well read articles published in current literature available on the subject and may think how the techniques and ideas discussed therein might be applied to the solution of other problems. He may discuss with others what he has in mind concerning a problem. In this way he should make all possible efforts in selecting a problem. V. The importance of the subject, the qualifications and the training of a researcher, the costs involved, the time factor are few other criteria that must also be considered in selecting a problem. In other words, before the final selection of a problem is done, a researcher must ask himself the following questions. A. Whether he is well equipped in terms of his background to carry out the research. B. Whether the study falls within the budget he can afford. C. Whether the necessary cooperation can be obtained from those who must participate in research as subjects. If the answers to all these questions are in the affirmative, one may become sure so far as the practicability of the study is concerned. V. The selection of a problem must be preceded by a preliminary study. This may not be necessary when the problem requires the conduct of a research closely similar to one that has already been done. But when the field of inquiry is relatively new and does not have available a set of well-developed techniques, a brief feasibility study must always be undertaken. If the subject for research is selected properly by observing the above-mentioned points, the research will not be a boring drudgery, rather it will be love's labor. In fact, zest for work is a must. The subject or the problem selected must involve the researcher and must have an uppermost place in his mind so that he may undertake all pains needed for the study. Necessity of defining the problem. Quite often we all hear that a problem clearly stated is a problem half solved. This statement signifies the need for defining a research problem. The problem to be investigated must be defined unambiguously, for that will help to discriminate relevant data from the irrelevant ones. A proper definition of research problem will enable the researcher to be on the track, whereas an ill-defined problem may create hurdles. Questions like, what data are to be collected? What characteristics of data are relevant and need to be studied? What relations are to be explored? What techniques are to be used for the purpose? And similar other questions crop up in the mind of the researcher, who can well plan his strategy and find answers to all such questions only when the research problem has been well defined. Thus, defining a research problem properly is a prerequisite for any study and is a step of the highest importance. In fact, formulation of a problem is often more essential than its defining the research problem. 27. Solution. It is only on careful detailing the research problem that we can work out the research design and can smoothly carry on all the consequential steps involved while doing research. Technique involved in defining a problem. Let us start with the question, what does one mean when she wants to define a research problem? The answer may be that one wants to state the problem along with the bounds within which it is to be studied. In other words, defining a problem involves the task of laying down boundaries within which a researcher shall study the problem with a predetermined objective in view. How to define a research problem is undoubtedly a Herculean task. However, it is a task that must be tackled intelligently to avoid the perplexity encountered in a research operation. The usual approach is that the researcher should himself pose a question, or in case someone else wants the researcher to carry on research, the concerned individual, organization or an authority should pose the question to the researcher and set up techniques and procedures for throwing light on the question concerned, for formulating or defining the research problem. But such an approach generally does not produce definitive results because the question phrased in such a fashion is usually in broad general terms and as such may not be in a form suitable for testing. Defining a research problem properly and clearly is a crucial part of a research study and must in no case be accomplished hurriedly. However, in practice this is frequently overlooked, which causes a lot of problems later on. Hence, the research problem should be defined in a systematic manner, giving due weightage to all relating points. The technique for the purpose involves the undertaking of the following steps, generally one after the other. I. Statement of the problem in a general way. E. Understanding the nature of the problem. E. Surveying the available literature. IV. Developing the ideas through discussions. And V. Rephrasing the research problem into a working proposition. A brief description of all these points will be helpful. I. Statement of the problem in a general way. First of all, the problem should be stated in a broad general way, keeping in view either some practical concern or some scientific or intellectual interest. For this purpose, the researcher must immerse himself thoroughly in the subject matter concerning which he wishes to pose a problem. In case of social research, it is considered advisable to do some field observation, and as such the researcher may undertake some sort of preliminary survey or what is often called pilot survey. Then the researcher can himself state the problem, or he can seek the guidance of the guide or the subject expert in accomplishing this task. Often, the guide puts forth the problem in general terms, and it is then up to the researcher to narrow it down and phrase the problem in operational terms. In case there is some directive from an organizational authority, the problem then can be stated accordingly. The problem stated in a broad general way may contain various ambiguities which must be resolved by cool thinking and rethinking over the problem. At the same time, the feasibility of a particular solution has to be considered, and the same should be kept in view while stating the problem. E. Understanding the nature of the problem. The next step in defining the problem is to understand its origin and nature clearly. The best way of understanding the problem is to discuss it with those who first raised it in order to find out how the problem originally came about and with what objectives in view. If the researcher has stated the problem himself, he should consider once again all those points that induced him to make a general statement concerning the problem. For a better 28 research methodology understanding of the nature of the problem involved, he can enter into discussion with those who have a good knowledge of the problem concerned or similar other problems. The researcher should also keep in view the environment within which the problem is to be studied and understood. E. Surveying the available literature. All available literature concerning the problem at hand must necessarily be surveyed and examined before a definition of the research problem is given. This means that the researcher must be well conversant with relevant theories in the field, reports and records, as also all other relevant literature. He must devote sufficient time in reviewing of research already undertaken on related problems. This is done to find out what data and other materials, if any, are available for operational purposes. Knowing what data are available often serves to narrow the problem itself as well as the technique that might be used. 2. This would also help a researcher to know if there are certain gaps in the theories, or whether the existing theories applicable to the problem under study are inconsistent with each other, or whether the findings of the different studies do not follow a pattern consistent with the theoretical expectations, and so on. All this will enable a researcher to take new strides in the field for furtherance of knowledge, i.e., he can move up starting from the existing premise. Studies on related problems are useful for indicating the type of difficulties that may be encountered in the present study, as also the possible analytical shortcomings. At times such studies may also suggest useful and even new lines of approach to the present problem. IV. Developing the ideas through discussions. Discussion concerning a problem often produces useful information. Various new ideas can be developed through such an exercise. Hence, a researcher must discuss his problem with his colleagues and others who have enough experience in the same area or in working on similar problems. This is quite often known as an experience survey. People with rich experience are in a position to enlighten the researcher on different aspects of his proposed study, and their advice and comments are usually invaluable to the researcher. They help him sharpen his focus of attention on specific aspects within the field. Discussions with such persons should not only be confined to the formulation of the specific problem at hand, but should also be concerned with the general approach to the given problem, techniques that might be used, possible solutions, etc. V. Rephrasing the research problem. Finally, the researcher must sit to rephrase the research problem into a working proposition. Once the nature of the problem has been clearly understood, the environment within which the problem has got to be studied has been defined, discussions over the problem have taken place, and the available literature has been surveyed and examined, rephrasing the problem into analytical or operational terms is not a difficult task. Through rephrasing, the researcher puts the research problem in as specific terms as possible so that it may become operationally viable and may help in the development of working hypotheses. In addition to what has been stated above, the following points must also be observed while defining a research problem. To Robert Ferber and P.J. Verdorn, Research Methods in Economics and Business, p. 33-34. Working hypotheses are a set of suggested tentative solutions of explanations of a research problem which may or may not be the real solutions. The task of research is to test and establish such hypotheses. Hypotheses should be clearly and precisely stated in simple terms, they should be testable, limited in scope and should state relationship between variables. They should be amenable to testing within a reasonable time and should be consistent with most of the known facts. Testing of hypotheses has been dealt with later in the book. Defining the research problem. 29. A. Technical terms and words or phrases, with special meanings used in the statement of the problem, should be clearly defined. B. Basic assumptions or postulates, if any, relating to the research problem should be clearly stated. C. A straightforward statement of the value of the investigation, i.e., the criteria for the selection of the problem, should be provided. D. The suitability of the time period and the sources of data available must also be considered by the researcher in defining the problem. E. The scope of the investigation or the limits within which the problem is to be studied must be mentioned explicitly in defining a research problem. A. An illustration. The technique of defining a problem outlined above can be illustrated for better understanding by taking an example as under. Let us suppose that a research problem in a broad general way is as follows. Why is productivity in Japan so much higher than in India? In this form the question has a number of ambiguities such as, what sort of productivity is being referred to? With what industries the same is related? With what period of time the productivity is being talked about? In view of all such ambiguities, the given statement or the question is much too general to be amenable to analysis. Rethinking and discussions about the problem may result in narrowing down the question to: what factors were responsible for the higher labor productivity of Japan's manufacturing industries during the decade 1971 to 1980 relative to India's manufacturing industries? This latter version of the problem is definitely an improvement over its earlier version, for the various ambiguities have been removed to the extent possible. Further rethinking and rephrasing might place the problem on a still better operational basis as shown below. To what extent did labor productivity in 1971 to 1980 in Japan exceed that of India in respect of 15 selected manufacturing industries? What factors were responsible for the productivity differentials between the two countries by industries? With this sort of formulation, the various terms involved such as labor productivity differentials, etc. must be explained clearly. The researcher must also see that the necessary data are available. In case the data for one or more industries selected are not available for the concerning time period, then the said industry or industries will have to be substituted by other industry or industries. The suitability of the time period must also be examined. Thus, all relevant factors must be considered by a researcher before finally defining a research problem. Conclusion: we may conclude by saying that the task of defining a research problem, very often, follows a sequential pattern. The problem is stated in a general way, the ambiguities are resolved, thinking and rethinking process results in a more specific formulation of the problem so that it may be a realistic. 30. Research methodology. 1. In terms of the available data and resources and is also analytically meaningful. All this results in a well-defined research problem that is not only meaningful from an operational point of view, but is equally capable of paving the way for the development of working hypotheses and for means of solving the problem itself. Questions 1.